Before the world began, before time itself, there was a rebellion in heaven, a war unlike any other, a battle between light and darkness, between the Almighty and His most powerful creation. He was once the most beautiful of all angels, the morning star, the bearer of light. But pride turned him into something else, something darker. His name was Lucifer, but you know him by another name, Satan. Cast out of heaven, thrown down to earth, his hatred for God burned brighter than ever. And so he swore his revenge, not by fighting God directly, but by corrupting what God loved most, mankind. This is the story of the greatest war ever fought, a war for the souls of men, a war that is not yet over. But in the end, there can only be one victor. The heavens stretched endlessly, filled with radiant light and the symphony of angelic voices. Beyond time and space, where mortals could never tread, lay the celestial kingdom of God. Rivers of molten gold flowed beneath towering crystalline structures, their reflections dancing across the sky like living fire. Among the heavenly host stood Lucifer, the morning star, the most resplendent of all God's creations. His wings, vast and shimmering like 1,000 gemstones, bore the hues of the dawn, silver, sapphire, and gold. His face shone with an almost unbearable beauty, and his voice, when raised in worship, was unmatched in all of creation. Lucifer was no ordinary angel. He was a cherub of the highest order, entrusted with guarding the very throne of the Almighty. Wisdom filled his mind, and his power extended over the multitudes of lesser angels who served at his command. His duty was sacred, to orchestrate the divine music of heaven and to stand as a beacon of praise before the Most High. For eons, he had carried out his purpose with joy. But in the stillness of eternity, a thought took root, one that had never before entered the heart of any created being. Why must he, the most magnificent of all creatures, serve when he could rule? Lucifer stood upon the highest peak of the celestial mountains, gazing at the great throne where the Almighty sat in radiant majesty. Around the throne, 4 living creatures, their forms beyond mortal comprehension, sang day and night, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was, and is to come." Thousands of angels bowed in reverence, their forms radiant with the purest devotion. Lucifer, too, had once knelt willingly, but now something burned in his heart. He turned away from the sight, his wings folding behind him as he descended into the gardens of heaven. His thoughts swirled, dark and intoxicating. He had been made perfect, greater than all others, yet he was not God. Why should I bow when I am nearly his equal? The thought whispered. Lucifer, in his wisdom, knew he could not voice these thoughts aloud, but he pondered them, letting them take shape, feeding them with his own pride. If he could convince others, those who also saw his greatness, then perhaps he could be more than a servant. Perhaps he could rule. Lucifer moved through the heavens, unseen and unheard, his mind turning over a plan so vast and terrible that even he scarcely believed it. He would not act alone. No, he would gather an army. The angels loved him, revered him, some even feared him. He had long been their leader in music and worship. How many among them had wondered why one as great as he should bow to another? He began subtly, speaking in hushed tones to those who admired him most. "Have you ever questioned why we bow before the throne, when we are mighty ourselves?" he asked one of the warrior angels. "I do not question the will of the Almighty," the angel replied cautiously. Lucifer only smiled. "Of course. But have you ever wondered, what if there was another way, a better way?" The idea planted itself like a seed in the minds of many. Some dismissed it, but others lingered, drawn to the words they dared not speak themselves. And so, in the silent corridors of heaven, the whisper of rebellion began to grow. For the first time in eternity, conflict arose in heaven. Lucifer had gathered a third of the angels, those who believed in his vision of a kingdom where they would no longer serve, but rule. The skies darkened with the wings of the rebels as they prepared to seize what had never been taken, power from the Almighty himself. But God, who sees all, had already set his judgment in motion. From the highest reaches of heaven, Michael the archangel descended, leading the armies of the righteous. His sword, wreathed in holy fire, gleamed as he confronted Lucifer. "You are the greatest among us, morning star. Why have you fallen so low?" Michael's voice rang through the heavens like thunder. Lucifer's eyes burned with defiance. "I have risen, not fallen. We were meant for more than servitude. I will take my rightful throne." With a cry, the battle began. Lightning flashed as angelic swords clashed. The heavens trembled as the once harmonious host of angels now warred against each other. Fire and light tore through the sky, and the very fabric of eternity quaked with the fury of their battle. Lucifer fought with all his might, his once glorious form now twisted by rage. But against the righteous, against the will of the Almighty, he could not prevail. With a final, terrible blow, Michael struck Lucifer down. The morning star, once the pride of heaven, fell. Silence fell over the battlefield as the voice of God thundered across the heavens. "Lucifer, son of the morning, you have lifted yourself in pride and sought to claim my throne, but none shall be as the Most High. You are cast down, banished from my presence forever." A great chasm opened beneath Lucifer and his followers. They screamed as they were pulled downward, their wings torn, their radiant forms darkened into twisted shapes of their former selves. Falling, they plummeted, cast out of paradise. To the earth they were sent, to dwell in shadow and ruin. Their beauty turned to horror. No longer was Lucifer the morning star. He was now Satan, the adversary, the deceiver of the world. The war in heaven was over, but the war for mankind was just beginning. Darkness. Lucifer, now Satan, plummeted through the endless void, his wings tattered, his once glorious radiance swallowed by shadow. Around him, the cries of the fallen angels, his followers, echoed through the abyss as they hurtled toward their new prison. The moment he struck the earth, a tremor split the land, a wound carved into creation itself. Dust and fire rose where he fell, the force of his descent shaking the very foundations of the world. The other fallen angels landed in different places, scattered across the land, dazed and disoriented, their celestial forms twisted into something dark and unholy. Satan rose from the crater, his once beautiful form now marred by his own ambition. His once glorious wings were blackened, his light extinguished, his heart seething with fury. He had been cast down, rejected, stripped of his former splendor. But as he surveyed the world around him, something else stirred within him, not despair. If he could not rule in heaven, he would rule here. If he could not be worshipped above the Almighty, then he would make creation itself bow to him in another way. He turned his gaze upward, staring at the heavens, his eyes burning with defiance. "You think you have won, Most High? This world, I will make it my kingdom. Your creation will turn against you. They will worship me instead." His voice, now a terrible thing, carried across the desolate land a promise of war that would echo through the ages. Satan wandered the earth, his fury festering as he watched the world take shape. The rivers shimmered with purity, the mountains stood strong and unshaken, and the sky remained untouched by the corruption he longed to spread. But then something new happened. A voice rang out, not in wrath but in love. "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Satan froze. The air trembled with divine power, as before his very eyes, man was formed from the dust of the earth, a being unlike any other, not an angel, not a god. And yet, created in the very image of the Almighty, he watched as the Creator breathed life into the figure, and the man opened his eyes for the first time. His name was Adam. Satan seethed. Even in his fall, he could not comprehend why the Almighty would favor such a lowly creature, formed from the dirt beneath his feet. And then another, a woman, Eve, formed from Adam's side. The two stood together, basking in the presence of God, walking with him in the paradise of Eden. Satan's fury turned to something more dangerous, a plan. If he could not overthrow the Almighty directly, he would strike at the ones he loved most. He would corrupt mankind. He would turn them against their Creator, and in doing so, he would wound the heart of the Almighty himself. The Garden of Eden was a paradise beyond anything Satan had ever known. Every tree bore fruit more beautiful than the golden rivers of heaven, and in its center stood the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was there that Satan made his move. Taking the form of a serpent, he coiled around the branches of the forbidden tree, watching as Eve approached, her curiosity drawing her closer. She glanced at the fruit, her eyes full of wonder. Satan's voice slithered into the air, smooth as silk. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Eve hesitated. We may eat the fruit of any tree, she answered. But of this tree God said, you shall not eat it nor touch it, or you will die. Satan chuckled. You will not surely die, he whispered. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil. Eve looked at the fruit again. It was beautiful, desirable, and if it would make her like God. She reached out. She took a bite. The moment the fruit touched her lips, the ground seemed to shudder. A terrible shift had occurred, one that Satan could feel in his very being. He had done it. She turned and handed the fruit to Adam. He too ate. And then everything changed. Their innocence was stripped away, replaced by shame. They saw their nakedness for the first time and hid themselves from the presence of God. Satan withdrew, watching from the shadows, his laughter echoing through the trees. He had won the first battle, but he knew the war was far from over. Dark clouds gathered over Eden as the Almighty descended. The voice that once called with warmth and love now thundered with sorrow. Adam, where are you? Trembling, Adam and Eve emerged from their hiding place, their faces full of guilt. God's gaze fell upon Satan, still lurking in the shadows. Because you have done this, you are cursed above all creatures. You will crawl on your belly, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. Satan sneered, but God was not finished. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Satan stiffened. This was more than a curse. It was a prophecy. A descendant of the woman would rise, one who would destroy him. For the first time since his fall, fear gripped Satan's heart. He had succeeded in corrupting mankind, but the Almighty had already set in motion a plan to undo his work. The war was not over. It had only begun. Satan roamed the earth, watching as the children of Adam and Eve spread across the land. The curse of sin had taken root, twisting humanity's nature, filling their hearts with envy, hatred, and rebellion. It was glorious. Where once the world had been pure, now it was tainted. Where once mankind had walked in harmony with God, now they hid from him in shame. Satan had won the first battle, but he knew the war was far from over. The Almighty's prophecy haunted him. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. A descendant of the woman, one who would destroy him. Satan knew he could not undo God's will, but he could fight against it. If humanity was meant to bring forth this Redeemer, then he would corrupt them all. And so he began his work. The first great tragedy came quickly. Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. Abel, the righteous, offered his best sacrifice to God, and the Almighty accepted it. But Cain, whose heart was filled with jealousy, watched in anger as his own offering was rejected. Satan saw his opening. Why should your brother be favored over you? He whispered into Cain's heart. You are stronger than him. You are greater than him. Take what is yours. Cain's fingers tightened around a stone. His breath came in sharp gasps as rage consumed him. The whispers grew louder, drowning out reason, twisting his soul into darkness. And then, a cry split the earth as Abel fell, his blood soaking the ground. Mankind's first murder. Satan smiled. He had turned brother against brother, planting the seeds of violence that would spread for generations. If God sought to bring forth a righteous one to crush him, Satan would make sure the world was too corrupt to receive him. Centuries passed, and mankind multiplied. Cities rose, kingdoms formed, and with them came greed, war, and idolatry. Satan moved like a shadow, whispering lies into the hearts of rulers, feeding their lust for power. He taught men to worship false gods, to sacrifice their own children upon fiery altars, to spill innocent blood in his name. The world belonged to him now. But then, something happened. A man, a righteous man, walked with God. His name was Noah. Satan seethed as he watched the Almighty speak to this man, giving him instructions to build an ark. A flood was coming, a judgment upon the wickedness that Satan had spread. For the first time since his fall, he felt something dangerously close to defeat. If God wiped out this generation, would the prophecy still stand? Would the promised one still come? He had to act. Satan stirred the hearts of men against Noah, filling them with mockery and scorn. He whispered to kings, urging them to silence the prophet before the ark could be completed. But it was no use. The flood came, and with it, his kingdom drowned. Noah and his family survived, and with them the promise remained. Satan had lost a great battle, but he would not stop fighting. As the generations passed, he worked tirelessly to turn men's hearts away from the Almighty. He built empires of darkness, whispering into the ears of pharaohs, priests, and kings. He raised tyrants who enslaved nations, rulers who declared themselves gods, and armies that crushed the innocent. He tempted the great and the small alike, drawing them into corruption, blinding them to the truth. And yet, there was always a remnant, a chosen people, a nation set apart, Israel. Satan knew that if the promised one was to come, he would come from them. And so, he focused all his power against them. He turned Pharaoh against them, leading to their enslavement in Egypt. He whispered doubt into their hearts in the wilderness, leading them to rebel against Moses. He lured them into idolatry, making them bow to golden calves and foreign gods. Time and again, he sought to break them, to wipe them from existence. But God always preserved them. The prophecy was still alive. And then, one day, in a quiet town of Bethlehem, it happened. A child was born. Not just any child. The one who would crush his head. The war had reached its climax. Satan stood on the highest mountain, his darkened wings spread wide as he watched the world below. He had ruled the earth for millennia, twisting humanity into his image, corrupting their hearts with pride, lust, and violence. Kingdoms had risen and fallen at his command. He had turned kings into tyrants, priests into deceivers, and nations into dens of iniquity. But now, something had changed. The child had been born, the one foretold in Eden, the one who would crush his head. For centuries, he had prepared for this moment. He had slaughtered infants in Egypt through Pharaoh. He had stirred Herod to commit the same atrocity in Bethlehem, hoping to cut off the prophecy before it could take root. But he had failed. The boy had survived, and now he had grown. Satan watched as the man called Jesus walked into the wilderness alone. For 40 days and 40 nights he fasted, his body growing weaker. But his spirit, Satan could feel its strength. This was no ordinary man. He descended upon the barren wasteland, his form shifting from shadow to flesh, his eyes burning with dark intent. He had deceived kings, prophets, and priests before. This one would be no different. Standing before the weary traveler, he spoke, his voice smooth and inviting. "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." Jesus, though tired and hungry, did not waver. His voice was steady as he replied, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Satan's smile faded. No matter, he had other ways. In an instant, they stood at the highest point of the temple in Jerusalem. Below, the priests and worshippers moved about, oblivious to the battle unfolding above them. "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down," Satan said, his voice laced with false sweetness. "For it is written, He will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus did not flinch, his eyes, piercing and steady, locked onto Satan's. It is also written, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." Satan clenched his jaw. This was not going as he had planned. One more chance. With a wave of his hand, the world shifted. Nations, empires, armies all flashed before Jesus' eyes. Kingdoms in their splendor, thrones of gold, riches beyond measure. "All of this I will give you," Satan whispered, his voice low and full of promise, "if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus turned to him, his voice like thunder. "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, 'You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve.'" A shockwave of divine power erupted, forcing Satan back. He had lost this battle, but the war was not over. For years, Satan watched as Jesus moved through the world, healing the sick, casting out demons, and proclaiming a kingdom that was not of this earth. It enraged him. He could feel his grip on humanity slipping. The people flocked to this man, their eyes filled with something Satan had worked tirelessly to destroy: hope. This had to end. He moved swiftly, infiltrating the heart of one of Jesus' closest followers, Judas Iscariot. A weak man, filled with greed and doubt, the perfect tool. With a whisper in the dark, the seed was planted. 30 pieces of silver, a kiss in the garden, chains and whips, a cross upon his back. Satan watched, a wicked grin spreading across his face as the nails were driven into Jesus' hands and feet. The King of Heaven, humiliated, beaten, bleeding upon the cursed wood. The people mocked him. "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Satan laughed. "Where is your power now?" he sneered. "Where are your angels? You were supposed to crush me, but I have crushed you." Jesus lifted his head, his eyes meeting Satan's unseen presence. And then with his final breath, he spoke, "It is finished," and the earth shook. The sky went black. The veil of the temple tore in two. Something was wrong. Satan staggered back. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was his victory. Jesus was dead. He had won. But then, why did it feel like he had lost? For 3 days, the world remained in mourning. Jesus lay in the tomb, lifeless. But deep in the unseen realms, in the very depths of darkness, something stirred. A light, a blinding, holy light, shattered the gates of death. Satan recoiled as the force of it ripped through his domain. He screamed as Jesus rose, radiant and victorious, breaking the power of sin and death. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The seed of the woman had come. The war had been won. And though Satan still roamed the earth, seeking whom he might devour, he knew his time was short. For one day, he would face his final judgment. Satan stood upon the ruined earth, his once glorious wings now tattered shadows, his form twisted by centuries of hatred and rebellion. The war had been long, stretching through the ages, fought in the hearts of men, in the rise and fall of kingdoms, in the silent battles between light and darkness. And now, it was coming to an end. The signs were undeniable. The prophecies foretold it. The Almighty had declared it from the beginning. His time was short. The nations trembled, the heavens darkened, and the armies of the earth prepared for a final battle. But it was not against each other. It was against the King of Kings. Satan had known for millennia that his fate was sealed, but he was not one to surrender. Even as he watched the world crumble, he clung to the same arrogance that had led to his downfall. "If I must fall, then I will take all of creation with me." And so he gathered his armies. The kings of the earth, the rulers blinded by power, the lost souls who had traded eternity for the fleeting pleasures of sin. They marched, their weapons raised, their voices crying out in defiance. And then the heavens opened. A blinding light split the sky, and through it came the one he had always feared. Riding upon a white horse, clothed in light, his eyes burning with holy fire, Jesus, the King of Glory. His armies followed, clad in white, their banners bearing the mark of the Almighty. The heavens shook at his arrival. Satan roared, launching himself forward, his armies surging behind him. But it was over before it even began. The king spoke, and the words that left his mouth were like a sword, cutting through the darkness, tearing apart the forces of evil. The battle was won in an instant. Satan fell, his power stripped away, his dominion shattered. And then the judgment came. Satan was dragged, bound in chains of fire, before the great white throne of judgment. Around him, all who had rebelled against the Almighty trembled. Kings, tyrants, deceivers, none could escape. And before him stood the Almighty himself. For the first time since his fall, Satan felt fear. The voice that had cast him from heaven, the voice that had declared the prophecy, the voice that had spoken the universe into existence, now spoke his final sentence. Depart from me, accursed one, into the everlasting fire prepared for you and your angels. The gates of the abyss opened, a pit of unquenchable fire, a realm of eternal separation from the presence of the Almighty. Satan screamed. He fought, clawed, desperately trying to escape his fate, but it was over. He was cast into the lake of fire, his cries of fury and despair swallowed by the eternal flames. Never again would he deceive. Never again would he destroy. Never again would he rise. The enemy of God was no more. And then a great silence fell. The old world had passed away. The curse of sin was no more. The Almighty stretched out his hand, and behold, a new heaven and a new earth were formed. The rivers ran pure once more. The land was filled with life, and God dwelled with his people. No more pain, no more death, no more tears. The war was over. Light had triumphed over darkness, and his kingdom would reign forever and ever. This was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of eternity. A kingdom where righteousness, peace, and joy would never fade. A kingdom where the Almighty reigned forever. And all who had chosen the light, who had resisted the lies of the enemy, who had placed their faith in the one who overcame, would dwell with him in glory for all time. For the victory had already been won. It was always his. It was always finished. Satan's story is a tragedy, a warning of what pride and rebellion can bring. But for those who choose the light, there is hope. For the same God who cast Satan from heaven is the same God who offers grace to those who seek him. And in the end, only one kingdom will remain. The question is, which side will you stand on? The battle was over. The darkness had been swallowed by light. Satan, the great deceiver, the adversary of God and man, had been cast into the lake of fire, never to rise again. His power was broken, his rebellion silenced. The war that had begun in heaven, that had spread to the earth, that had raged for millennia in the hearts of men, had ended. And now a new kingdom had begun. John, the last of the apostles, had seen it in a vision long ago. And now that vision had become reality. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. Revelation 21:1-2. The heavens had been made new, brighter and purer than before. The earth, once scarred by sin, had been restored. The rivers ran with living water. The trees bore fruit in every season, and no trace of death remained. The holy city, the new Jerusalem, descended in brilliance, gleaming with the glory of God. Its gates stood open, its streets shone with gold, and in its center, upon the throne, sat the Almighty himself. And then his voice rang out, "Behold, I am making all things new. The dwelling place of God is now with man, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and he will be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the former things have passed away." Revelation 21:3-4. The curse of sin was gone, the weight of sorrow, the sting of death, the ache of longing, gone. Every wound healed, every heart restored. This was the eternal kingdom. Before the gates of the New Jerusalem, the last judgment took place. The book of life was opened, and all who had ever lived stood before the throne. Kings and beggars, the powerful and the weak, the known and the forgotten. Each soul was judged, not by their wealth, not by their strength, not by their deeds, but by one thing alone: did they know him? For those whose names were written in the book of life, the gates of the eternal kingdom stood open. They entered, stepping into a glory beyond imagination, welcomed into the presence of God, where joy would never fade. But for those who had rejected the truth, who had followed the path of the adversary, who had refused the gift of grace, their fate was sealed. The second death, the lake of fire, eternal separation from the Almighty. Satan was already there, along with his fallen angels and all who had chosen to follow him. Their rebellion had cost them everything. And now justice was complete. Jesus, the Lamb who was slain, the King who conquered, now reigned over all. His kingdom was without end. His people were with him forever. There was no more sun or moon, for the glory of God was the light. There was no temple, for God himself dwelled with his people. There were no closed gates, no fear, no darkness, only life, only love, only eternity. The promise that had been spoken in the garden, the war that had raged across ages, had led to this moment. God had won, and he had always known he would. And now a voice calls out, just as it did in ancient times. Come, let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who desires take the water of life freely. Revelation 22:17. The gates of the eternal city stand open. The King calls. The war is over, the kingdom is here, and the choice remains. Will you enter, or will you turn away? For the time is near, and he is coming soon. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this, stories of truth, faith, and destiny, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Join the journey. Subscribe now, and remember, the greatest story ever told is still unfolding.